Hello, everyone.
Can we be honest about what we really want? His voice was low, steady, and way too calm for how much chaos those words stirred inside me. I froze. Standing there in the dim kitchen, I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, heavy and different. Caleb wasn't just asking a question. He was daring me. Daring me to admit something I wasn't ready to face. I clutched the edge of the counter, trying to keep my hands from trembling. I I don't know what you mean, I muttered, avoiding his eyes, though I could still feel them on me, piercing right through my weak attempt at denial. You do, he said, stepping just a little closer. Too close. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, that familiar, warm scent I shouldn't have noticed, but always did. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I was afraid he could hear it. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Caleb was my mom's husband. He shouldn't be standing this close. He shouldn't be looking at me like that, like I was something more than her daughter. And I definitely shouldn't have been feeling this, whatever this was, a rush of heat and nerves that made it impossible to think straight. Caleb, stop, I whispered, though even I didn't believe it. My voice sounded weak, shaky, like I was unsure whether I wanted him to stop or come even closer. He didn't move back. He just stood there, watching me, waiting. You felt it too, haven't you? He asked quietly, his tone calm, almost gentle, but with an edge that sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to scream no. To push him away and pretend none of this was real. But my body betrayed me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Because deep down, I knew the truth. I had felt it. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand, every moment we'd been left alone. I'd felt something I wasn't supposed to feel. And now, here we were. I don't know what you're talking about, I lied, my voice barely more than a whisper. I hated how breathless I sounded, like I was already caught in something I couldn't escape. He took another step forward, and suddenly the counter was pressing into my back, leaving me with nowhere to go. My heart pounded so hard, I was sure he could hear it. If you really don't know, he said softly, his face now dangerously close to mine, then why aren't you walking away? I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but I didn't want to admit it. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, anything, to end this before it went too far. But my body stayed frozen in place, caught between fear and something else. I should go, I said quickly, breaking the silence that was growing unbearable. I ducked under his arm before he could say anything else, my heart racing as I hurried toward the stairs. Good night, Caleb. He didn't stop me. But he didn't move either. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced back. He was still standing there, his eyes following me, a look in them I couldn't decipher. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. I shut the door to my room behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. How had it gotten this far? How had I let it get this far? I told myself it was nothing. Just a weird moment, something we could both forget by morning. But deep down, I knew better. Caleb wasn't going to forget. And neither was I. The next morning, everything looked exactly the same. The same cozy kitchen, the same quiet chatter from my mom, and the familiar smell of fresh coffee filling the air. But something felt different. No, not just different or wrong. The atmosphere was heavy, weighed down by something unspoken, something only Caleb and I could feel. Every time he entered the room, I felt it. That unbearable tension, thick and suffocating. Every glance he gave me, every accidental brush of his hand when we passed each other, only made it worse. And the worst part? I couldn't stop thinking about it. About him. I tried to act normal. To smile, to help my mom with breakfast, to answer her questions like nothing had happened. But inside, I was a mess. A storm of emotions swirled inside me through shame, fear, guilt, and desire. I hated that last one the most. It made everything so much more complicated. How are you today? Mom asked brightly as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Fine, I said quickly, keeping my eyes fixed on my plate. I didn't dare look across the table, where Caleb sat silently, sipping his coffee as if nothing was wrong. But I knew better. Even when he was silent, his presence was impossible to ignore. It was like a constant pull, a gravity that kept dragging me toward him no matter how hard I tried to resist. I ate quickly, barely tasting the food. I needed to get out. To breathe. I think I'll go for a walk, I said abruptly, pushing my chair back. Good idea, Mom said with a smile. Fresh air will do you good. I grabbed my coat and headed out before Caleb could say anything. The cool morning air hit my face, sharp and refreshing, but it did little to calm the chaos inside me. I walked aimlessly, letting my feet carry me through familiar streets. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape my thoughts. His voice echoed in my mind. You felt it too, haven't you? I hated how those words had stayed with me, how they made my heart race every time I remembered them. He wasn't supposed to say things like that. I wasn't supposed to feel the way I did. This was wrong. So wrong. And yet, despite everything, a part of me didn't want it to stop. I wandered into a small park and sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree. The cool breeze rustled the leaves above me, and for a moment I closed my eyes, hoping the peace of the park would help clear my mind. But it didn't. The storm inside me raged on, refusing to be silenced. I didn't know how long I sat there, lost in thought. Minutes, maybe hours. All I knew was that when I finally stood up and started walking home, nothing had changed. The tension, the confusion, the forbidden desire, they were all still there, waiting for me. When I got back home, the house was quiet. Mom was upstairs, probably working on something in her office. I headed to the kitchen, intending to grab a glass of water, but froze when I saw Caleb standing by the counter. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, filled with everything we weren't saying. I should have turned around and left. I should have gone to my room and locked the door. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped into the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. Did you enjoy your walk? He asked casually, as if we were just two normal people having a normal conversation. It was fine, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. I moved to the sink, filling a glass with water, and tried to ignore the way his presence made my skin tingle. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body. You seem tense, he said quietly, his voice low and calm. I'm fine, I said quickly, taking a sip of water to hide the way my hands were trembling. But I wasn't fine. I was anything but fine. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, watching me with that same unreadable expression he always had. And then, quietly, he said, You don't have to be afraid. I set the glass down, my hands gripping the edge of the counter to keep them steady. I'm not afraid, I said, though my voice betrayed me. Yes, you are, he said softly, taking a step closer. You're afraid of what this means. Of what we both feel. I turned to face him, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Whatever this is, it has to stop, I said, forcing the words out even though every part of me was screaming at me to stop talking. He didn't move, didn't back away. Do you really want it to stop? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Because I didn't know. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. All I knew was that standing here, so close to him, made it impossible to think straight. Before I could say anything else, footsteps echoed from upstairs. Lan. The sound broke whatever spell had been holding us in place, and I quickly stepped back, putting distance between us. I should go, I said quickly, turning toward the stairs. "Good night, Anna," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my breath hitch. I didn't respond. I just hurried upstairs, closing the door to my room behind me. Leaning against the door, I tried to steady my breathing, but it was no use. The storm inside me was stronger than ever, and I had no idea how to stop it. The next few days were torture. Every time I saw him, every time we were in the same room, the tension grew thicker. We barely spoke, but words weren't necessary. The unspoken connection between us was undeniable, and it was driving me insane. I tried to avoid him as much as I could, but it didn't help. He was always there, always watching, always making me feel things I wasn't supposed to feel. And the worst part? A part of me didn't want him to stop. And trust me, this is just the beginning. What happened next? Things got even more intense, more dangerous, and way more complicated. I walked for what felt like hours, trying to clear my head, to shake off the weight of everything that had happened. But it was useless. Every step only brought me back to the night before, his words, his gaze, the tension that refused to fade. I knew I had to stop this before it spiraled out of control. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it might already be too late. By the time I got home, night had fallen, casting shadows across the quiet street. The house was silent, almost unnervingly so. Mom had gone to bed early, as she always did. I headed straight to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would steady my nerves. But then I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You've been out for a while," Caleb said, his voice calm, almost casual, yet laced with something that made my pulse quicken. "Yeah," I replied shortly, keeping my back to him. I gripped the glass tighter, silently willing him to leave. But he didn't. Instead, he moved closer, and suddenly the air between us grew thick again, heavy with unspoken tension. "I've been thinking too," he said after a pause, his tone quieter now, more measured. His words hung in the air, making me turn to face him despite myself. His eyes met mine, and for a moment everything else faded. There was something in his gaze, something raw, something dangerous. Desire. I could see it, feel it, and it terrified me as much as it drew me in. "Caleb, we can't," I started, my voice faltering as he took another step toward me. "I know," he said softly, his voice steady, unwavering. "But it's already happened. And you know it." Before I could react, his hand reached out, brushing lightly against mine. The touch was barely there, but it sent a jolt through me, making my breath hitch. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried so much weight, so much meaning. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to end this before it went any further. But I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, loud and erratic, as if it was trying to drown out the chaos in my head. "We have to stop," I whispered, though even I didn't believe the words. "Do you want to stop?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching mine. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because I didn't know. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. All I knew was that standing here, with him so close, made it impossible to think straight. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. Every second that passed only intensified the tension, making it harder to breathe. I should have said something, done something, but instead, I stood there, frozen, caught between fear and something else. Something I wasn't ready to admit. Then, without warning, he leaned in, closing the small gap between us. The world around us seemed to blur, fade into nothing. There was only him, only us. And when his lips brushed against mine, I didn't stop him. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into it, into him, letting the warmth of his touch consume me. It was wrong. Every part of me knew it was wrong. But in that moment, it didn't matter. His hand slid up, gently cupping my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek in a way that made my skin tingle. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears as the kiss deepened, becoming something either of us could control. For a brief second, reality tried to break through, reminding me of who we were, of the line we were crossing. But it was drowned out by the rush of emotions, the overwhelming intensity of the moment. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our faces mere inches apart. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the lingering touch of his lips on mine. And in that instant, I knew there was no going back. "I shouldn't have done that," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But you did," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. "And so did I." I stepped back, needing to put some distance between us, needing to breathe. But it didn't help. The tension was still there, stronger than ever, and it wrapped around me like a vice, refusing to let go. "I need to go," I said quickly, turning away before he could say anything else. My heart was still racing as I hurried out of the kitchen, up the stairs, and into my room. I shut the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to calm down. What had I just done? What had we just done? Guilt clawed at my insides, mixing with something far more dangerous: desire. I hated myself for what had happened, but I hated even more how much I wanted it to happen again. The next day, I tried to pretend everything was normal. I smiled, made small talk, went through the motions of the day as if nothing had changed. But it had. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't forget the way his lips had felt against mine, the way his touch had made my skin burn. Caleb was there, as always, silent but present, his eyes following me whenever he thought no one was watching. The tension between us was palpable, growing thicker with each passing moment. It was like a storm, building quietly but relentlessly, ready to explode at any second. I knew I should stay away from him, keep my distance. But every time I saw him, every time we were in the same room, that pull between us grew stronger. It was like being caught in a current, unable to swim back to shore. And the worst part? A part of me didn't want to. That evening, Mom went to bed early again, leaving Caleb and me alone in the living room. I sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV, but my mind was elsewhere, caught in the whirlwind of everything that had happened. "You okay?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I said quickly, not looking at him. But I could feel his eyes on me, could feel the tension thickening the air between us. "I've been thinking about last night," he said quietly, his voice low and calm, but carrying a weight that made my heart race. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. Because I had been thinking about it too. All day. And no matter how much I tried to push it away, it kept coming back. "We can't keep pretending this didn't happen," he continued, his tone steady but soft. "We crossed a line, Anna. We both know it." "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But we can't do this. It's wrong." "Then tell me to stop," he said, his eyes locked onto mine. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk away." I opened my mouth to say it, to end this before it went any further. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I didn't want him to stop. And that terrified me more than anything. The next few days were absolute torture. Every moment felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Caleb and I barely spoke, but it didn't matter, words weren't necessary. Every accidental touch, every glance exchanged in passing was enough to remind me of what had happened in the kitchen. And no matter how hard I tried to avoid him, it was impossible. He was always there, in the house, in my thoughts, in every breath I took. Mom didn't notice anything. She went about her days as if everything was perfectly normal. She seemed genuinely happy that I had come to stay for the weekend, completely oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Every time she smiled at me, every time she spoke to Caleb with warmth in her voice, guilt clawed at me. But the guilt wasn't enough to erase the other feeling, the one that refused to go away. The desire. It didn't fade. It only grew stronger, pulling me further into something I wasn't ready to face. By the time evening came, I was emotionally exhausted. I needed to be alone, to think, to breathe. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, hoping the quiet would help clear my head. But the moment I heard footsteps approaching, I knew that peace wasn't going to last. I didn't have to look up to know it was Caleb. My fingers tightened around the glass as he entered the room and took a seat across from me. The air between us grew thick almost instantly, charged with that same tension that had been haunting me for days. "Do you want to talk?" he asked quietly, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't know what I want," I admitted honestly. And it was true. I was torn between two conflicting desires, the need to step back and the overwhelming urge to move forward, to see where this would lead. "I don't either," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "But we can't keep pretending nothing is happening." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was deafening, filled with everything we weren't saying. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat echoing louder in my ears. I should have gotten up, walked away, ended this before it could go any further. But I didn't. I stayed rooted to my seat, unable to tear my eyes away from his. "You're making this harder than it has to be," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Am I?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. His eyes darkened, the intensity in them sending a shiver down my spine. "Or are you just afraid of what it means?" I hated how easily he saw through me, how effortlessly he could unravel every carefully constructed wall I tried to put up. "This isn't right," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Maybe not," he said softly. "But that doesn't change the fact that it's real." His words struck a chord deep inside me, one I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Because he was right. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, this, whatever this was, it was real. And it wasn't going away. "I can't do this," I said quietly, setting my glass down with trembling fingers. "I can't be that person." "You're not that person," he said firmly. "You didn't choose this. Neither of us did. But it's here now, and we have to figure out what to do about it." I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. I didn't want to be here, having this conversation. I didn't want to be in this situation. But there was no escaping it anymore. It was like a storm, relentless and unforgiving, and I was caught right in the middle of it. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "But don't pretend this isn't happening." With that, he stood up and left the room, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I sat there for a long time, staring at the glass of wine in front of me, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. Nothing made sense anymore. The tension only grew worse after that night. Every interaction, every moment we were in the same room, was filled with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. I tried to act normal, to pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't. And Caleb, he didn't make it any easier. He was always there, always watching, always making me feel things I wasn't supposed to feel. I knew I should stay away from him, but it was like trying to fight gravity. No matter how hard I tried to resist, I kept getting pulled back toward him. One evening, Mom went out to visit a friend, leaving Caleb and me alone in the house. I tried to keep myself busy, to distract myself with anything I could find. But nothing worked. Every sound, every shadow, reminded me that he was still here, just a few rooms away. Eventually, I gave up. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV. But my mind was elsewhere, lost in the chaos of my own emotions. "Mind if I join you?" Caleb's voice broke through the silence, making me jump slightly. "Sure," I said, forcing myself to sound casual even though my heart was racing. He sat down next to me, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. For a while, neither of us said anything. The only sound was the low hum of the TV, filling the space between us. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "You didn't," I said quickly, though we both knew it was a lie. He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way." His honesty caught me off guard, leaving me unsure of how to respond. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that I didn't know how to stop either. But the words caught in my throat, too heavy to say out loud. Instead, I just nodded, my eyes fixed on the TV even though I wasn't really watching it. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and charged, and I knew that if I didn't leave soon, something was going to happen. Something I wasn't ready for. "I think I'll go to bed," I said abruptly, standing up and setting my glass down. "Good night, Anna," he said softly, his eyes following me as I walked away. But even as I climbed the stairs and shut the door to my room, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. It happened faster than I could have imagined. One moment, I was standing across the room, trying to keep my distance. The next, I was right in front of him, so close that the tension between us became unbearable. His hand reached out, fingers brushing lightly against my cheek. The touch was soft, barely there, but it was enough to make me close my eyes and draw in a shaky breath. "We shouldn't," I whispered, but even I could hear the lie in my voice. I didn't want him to stop. And he knew it. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His lips were so close, too close, and when they finally met mine, it was like everything else ceased to exist. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned in, letting the kiss deepen, letting go of everything I had been fighting for so long. We both knew it was wrong. We both knew this was a line we could never uncross. But in that moment, none of it mattered. It felt inevitable. Like something we had both been moving toward from the start. Later, I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, still trying to process what had just happened. My mind was a mess of conflicting emotions. Guilt gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, whispering that this was a mistake, that it should have never happened. But there was something else too, something even more dangerous, the desire to do it again. I hated myself for wanting more. I hated that, despite everything, part of me wasn't sorry. Caleb had gone back to his room without saying much, leaving me alone with my spiraling thoughts. But even with him gone, his presence lingered. I could still feel the warmth of his touch, the weight of his gaze, and it made my chest tighten. I told myself that it was over, that it had to be over. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next morning was harder than I expected. Sitting at the breakfast table with Mom, pretending like nothing had happened, was torture. She smiled, oblivious to the chaos that had unfolded just a few feet away the night before. I forced a smile in return, but inside, I felt like I was breaking apart. Caleb walked in a few minutes later, calm and composed, as if nothing had changed. But when his eyes briefly met mine, I felt that same pull all over again. I looked away quickly, afraid that Mom would notice something, afraid that I'd give away the secret we now shared. Every second dragged by, every moment filled with tension I couldn't escape. And the worst part? I didn't want to escape. I wanted more. The thought scared me, but it was the truth. I couldn't stop thinking about him, couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind. It was wrong, and I knew it. But knowing didn't make it any easier to resist. I thought things would calm down, that the intensity would fade. But it didn't. The tension between us only grew stronger, and I found myself waiting for the next moment we'd be alone again. Waiting for something I shouldn't have wanted. And that's how it happened. One moment changed everything, and there was no going back. That's the end, or is it? Tell me, what would you have done? Would you have stopped it before it started? Or would you have crossed the line too? Let me know in the comments below.
Bye.